We traumatized a burglar, but it was so funny we got away with it. The burglar was already halfway through my bedroom window when I woke up at 3 in the morning. I'd been having a dream about drowning in paperwork at my accounting job, so seeing a grown man in a black hoodie struggling to squeeze through my window frame felt almost like a continuation of the nightmare. Except this nightmare was wearing Timberlands and grunting with effort as he tried to pull his considerable belly through an opening designed for air conditioning units, not human beings. I watched him for maybe 10 seconds, my brain slowly processing that this was real, before I reached over and turned on my bedside lamp. The burglar froze completely, one leg still dangling outside the window, his face registering the exact moment he realized he'd been caught mid-break-in. We made eye contact, and I said the first thing that came to my mind, which was, "Are you stuck?" The burglar's mouth opened and closed a few times before he said in this absolutely defeated voice, "Yeah, I think I might be stuck." I sat up in bed and looked at him more carefully. He was maybe 40 years old, overweight, sweating profusely despite the cool night air, and genuinely wedged in my window frame with his arms pinned at awkward angles. This was not a professional criminal. This was someone making terrible life choices. I should have called the police immediately. That's what any reasonable person would do. But I was wide awake now, and something about the sheer absurdity of the situation made me curious about how this would play out. I asked him why he'd chosen to rob my apartment specifically, and he said, "Your window was open and you're on the ground floor." I pointed out that my window was only open 4 inches for ventilation, and that he'd clearly had to force it wider to attempt entry. He conceded this point and asked if I could maybe help pull him through since we were having a conversation anyway. I said absolutely not, and asked what his plan had been once he got inside. The burglar sighed and explained he'd been planning to steal electronics and maybe jewelry if I had any. He said this apologetically, as if he felt bad about inconveniencing me with his burglary attempt. I told him I didn't own any jewelry, and my laptop was a 6-year-old Dell that barely ran. He looked genuinely disappointed by this information. I asked if he'd done this before, and he admitted this was his first attempted burglary. He'd lost his job 3 months ago, burned through his savings, and was facing eviction. He'd decided crime was his only option, but clearly he hadn't thought it through very well given he was currently stuck in a stranger's window at 3 in the morning. I grabbed my phone and called my roommate Leo, who was asleep in the next bedroom. He answered on the 5th ring, sounding extremely annoyed, until I explained there was a burglar stuck in my window, and he needed to come see this immediately. Leo arrived in his boxer shorts 30 seconds later, took one look at the situation, and started laughing so hard he had to lean against the door frame for support. The burglar looked mortified as Leo circled him, examining the physics of how someone gets wedged in a window frame. Leo asked if we should call the police, and I said probably, but maybe in a few minutes because this was too entertaining to end quickly. The burglar protested weakly that we really should call the authorities so he could face the consequences of his actions and move on with his evening. Leo suggested we take a photo first, and the burglar said, "Please don't do that." Leo immediately took 7 photos from different angles while the burglar closed his eyes in resignation. I asked the burglar his name, and he said Thomas Carver, but everyone called him Tom. Tom asked if we could please make our decision about calling the police because his ribs were really starting to hurt from the window frame, and he was losing feeling in his left leg. Leo examined the window situation and determined that Tom had gotten stuck because he'd tried to come through head first. His shoulders were too wide, and now he couldn't push himself back out because he had no leverage. My other roommate, Iris, knocked on my door asking what all the noise was about. She walked in, saw Tom stuck in the window, and immediately said, "Is that a burglar?" Tom confirmed that yes, he was attempting to burglarize the apartment, but had encountered some difficulties. Iris asked if we'd called the police, and Leo said not yet because we were still deciding how to handle the situation. Iris suggested we start by maybe getting Tom unstuck before he suffered permanent injury, which seemed like reasonable advice. She asked Tom if he could back out the way he came, and Tom explained he'd already tried that and couldn't get enough purchase with his feet to push himself backward. Iris suggested we try pulling him through from our side. Leo and I looked at each other and shrugged. Iris grabbed Tom's right arm, and I grabbed his left arm while Leo positioned himself behind us for additional pulling power. On the count of 3, we yanked hard. Tom screamed as he came through the window in one violent motion, sending all four of us tumbling backward onto my bedroom floor in a pile of limbs. Tom landed on top of me and immediately started apologizing profusely while trying to untangle himself. Leo was laughing again. Iris was checking if anyone was injured. And I was lying on my floor with a burglar on top of me, thinking that this was definitely the strangest night of my life. Tom stood up carefully, rubbing his ribs and rotating his shoulder to check for damage. He looked around my bedroom, taking in the minimal furniture and lack of valuable items, and said, "You weren't kidding about the laptop." I confirmed that I was not a lucrative burglary target. Tom sat down on my desk chair without being invited and put his head in his hands. He said he'd really screwed up his life, and this was rock bottom, getting stuck in a window while trying to rob someone who owned nothing worth stealing. Leo asked if Tom wanted some water, and Tom said yes, please, which felt surreal but also polite. Iris brought him a glass of water from the kitchen, and Tom drank it, while we all stood around my bedroom in an awkward silence. Finally, Leo said we still needed to decide what to do about this situation. I asked Tom directly what he thought should happen, and he said we should absolutely call the police because he'd committed a crime and needed to face consequences. But he said this with such obvious dread that I felt almost bad for him. Iris pointed out that if we called the police, Tom would get arrested, probably go to jail, definitely get a criminal record, and have an even harder time finding employment when he got out. Tom acknowledged this was all true, but said it was what he deserved for trying to steal from us. I had a terrible idea. I asked Tom if he'd learned his lesson about burglary, and Tom said absolutely. This had been the most humiliating experience of his life, and he would never attempt crime again. I proposed that instead of calling the police, we could traumatize Tom so thoroughly that he'd be too scared to ever commit another crime, and then let him go. Tom looked confused and asked what I meant by traumatize. Leo's eyes lit up, and he said this was the best idea I'd ever had. Iris looked skeptical but interested. I explained that Tom had come here to victimize us, so fair turnabout would be making him the victim of something worse than arrest, something that would haunt him but leave no physical harm. Tom said that sounded terrible, and he'd rather just go to jail. Leo said too bad. We were doing this now. Iris asked what I had in mind, and I admitted I hadn't thought that far ahead. Leo immediately started brainstorming ideas. We could do something with psychological horror, something that would make Tom question his reality. I suggested we could stage something that made Tom think he'd broken into the wrong house, somewhere dangerous. Iris caught on and suggested we could convince Tom he'd accidentally burglarized a serial killer's apartment. Tom said, "Please don't do that. He was already having a bad enough night." Leo ran to his room and came back with a duffel bag full of Halloween decorations left over from the party we'd thrown 2 months ago. He started pulling out fake cobwebs, plastic skulls, and battery-powered candles. Iris went to her room and returned with her makeup kit and some props from her theater background. I cleared everything off my desk and walls, making the room look more sparse and unsettling. Tom sat in the chair watching us transform my bedroom while repeatedly saying this wasn't necessary, and he'd really prefer to just face legal consequences. Within 15 minutes, we'd converted my cheerful bedroom into something that looked like a serial killer's lair. Fake cobwebs covered the corners. Plastic skulls sat on my bookshelf. The battery candles provided the only light, casting weird shadows. Iris had printed out fake newspaper clippings about unsolved murders in the area and taped them to the walls along with a map marked with red pins. Leo found some rope in the garage and coiled it ominously on my desk next to a collection of kitchen knives arranged in a pattern. Tom kept saying this was too much, and we should stop. We ignored him. I changed into all black clothing, and Leo styled my hair to look more unkempt. Iris did my makeup to make me look sleep-deprived and slightly unhinged. When we were done, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. The plan was simple. We'd pretend Tom had broken into my apartment while I was in the middle of planning my next murder. We'd make him think I was a dangerous criminal, and he'd stumbled into something far worse than a simple burglary charge. Leo and Iris would play the roles of my accomplices, who helped dispose of bodies. Tom would be so terrified that he'd never consider committing another crime. Tom said this plan was insane and borderline illegal itself. Leo said that was rich coming from someone who'd just tried to burglary us. Tom conceded the point. We sent Tom back outside through the front door and told him to come in through the window again so we could reset the scenario properly. Tom asked if this was really necessary, and we said yes, commit to the bit. Tom climbed back out my window with great difficulty, walked around to the front of the apartment building, and then had to climb back through the window while we watched and provided unhelpful commentary about his technique. Once he was halfway through the window again, stuck in the same position as before, we began. I turned on the lamp and acted startled. I grabbed one of the kitchen knives off my desk and pointed it at Tom while yelling about how he'd chosen the wrong house to break into. Tom played along, but with obvious reluctance, saying he was just looking for food and didn't mean any trouble. Leo burst into the room wearing a black hoodie and asked if we had a problem. I told him this idiot had just broken in while I was planning the Riverside Park job. Leo's eyes went wide and he said we couldn't let him leave now. He'd seen too much. Tom started to protest that he hadn't seen anything and didn't care what we were planning. He just wanted to leave. Iris entered wearing all black and carrying a bag of power tools for effect. She asked if this was the guy and should she get the van ready. Tom's face went pale. He tried to back out the window, but was still stuck. I walked over with the knife still in my hand and told him he'd made a terrible mistake coming here tonight. Tom actually looked scared now despite knowing this was fake. I asked him what he'd seen, and Tom stammered that he hadn't seen anything, just some newspaper clippings and a map. Leo said the newspaper clippings were his research into our previous work, and the map showed where we'd hidden certain items. Tom started breathing faster, genuine panic setting in, even though intellectually he knew this was theater. Iris asked what we should do with him, and Leo suggested we tie him up and decide later. Tom said, "Wait, you're not actually going to tie me up. This was supposed to just be psychological." I said we needed to commit to the realism for it to be effective. Tom tried to struggle back through the window, but couldn't get leverage. Leo and I grabbed his arms and pulled him fully into the room again. We sat Tom down in the desk chair, and Leo produced the rope we'd staged earlier. Tom's eyes went huge, and he said, "Okay, this had gone far enough. The lesson was learned. He would never commit crime again." Iris said we couldn't be sure of that unless we really scared him properly. I told Tom to put his hands behind the chair, and he actually did it, too startled to refuse. Leo tied his wrists together loosely enough that Tom could escape if he really tried, but tight enough to seem real. Tom was sweating again, his breathing rapid and shallow. I asked him if he understood what he'd walked into, and Tom nodded vigorously, saying he understood completely and would forget everything he'd seen. Iris circled behind him and asked what we usually did with witnesses. Leo said it depended on whether they could be trusted to keep quiet. I leaned down close to Tom's face and asked in a low voice if he could be trusted. Tom said yes, absolutely yes. He would never tell anyone about this. I asked what exactly he would never tell anyone about, and Tom stumbled over his words, trying to figure out what we wanted him to say. Leo said it seemed like he didn't really understand the situation. Maybe we needed to explain it more clearly. Iris opened her bag of power tools and pulled out a drill, turning it on so it made a loud whirring noise. Tom flinched and said please don't hurt him. He had a daughter who needed him. That stopped us cold. None of us had considered that Tom might have a child. I turned off my scary persona and asked if he really had a daughter. Tom nodded, tears forming in his eyes, and said she was 8 years old and lived with her mother. He said he'd been trying to steal money to pay child support because he was behind, and his ex-wife was threatening to cut off his visitation. The whole atmosphere in the room changed. Leo turned off the drill. Iris stepped back. I untied Tom's hands and sat down on my bed. We all looked at each other, suddenly feeling terrible about our elaborate prank. Tom was crying now, explaining that he'd lost his job as a warehouse manager 3 months ago, couldn't find new work, was facing eviction, and was desperate to maintain some relationship with his daughter. He said he knew burglary was wrong, but he'd been out of options and scared. I asked why he hadn't gone to social services or a shelter, and Tom said he'd tried, but the waiting lists were months long and he needed money immediately. The child support was due in 4 days, and if he didn't pay, his ex-wife was going to court to terminate his visitation rights completely. He'd already lost his apartment and was sleeping in his car. He'd seen our ground floor window open and made a stupid, desperate decision. Leo asked how much child support Tom owed, and Tom said $3,000 for the past 3 months. Iris asked if that was all that was keeping him from seeing his daughter, and Tom nodded. $3,000 and he'd be able to keep his visitation rights, find a shelter bed, and start looking for work without the panic of losing his child hanging over him. I looked at my bank account on my phone. I had about $800 saved. Leo had maybe $1,000. Iris had even less. None of us individually could solve Tom's problem, but collectively, we might make a dent. I suggested we each contribute what we could and try to help Tom instead of just traumatizing him. Leo agreed immediately. Iris said she could put in $200. Tom started protesting that he couldn't take our money, that he'd tried to rob us and didn't deserve help. I said he'd already been traumatized enough by getting stuck in our window twice and enduring our terrible theater production. The least we could do was help him avoid losing his daughter. Tom was crying harder now, saying he didn't understand why we were being kind to him after what he'd done. Leo said because his situation was clearly desperate, and desperate people made bad choices. But that didn't mean they deserved to lose everything. We spent the next hour at my kitchen table figuring out Tom's financial situation. He needed $3,000 for child support, but also first and last month's rent for a new apartment, money for food, and ideally some cushion while he job hunted. The total came to about $7,000 minimum. Leo suggested we call some of our friends and see if anyone could contribute. It was 4 a.m, but Leo texted our group chat explaining the situation without giving too many details. Within 20 minutes, 5 people had responded offering between $50 and $300 each. Tom kept saying he couldn't accept charity, but Iris pointed out that he'd literally tried to steal from us an hour ago, so accepting voluntary donations was actually morally superior. I created a fundraising page online with a vague description about helping a father avoid homelessness and maintain custody of his daughter. Leo shared it on social media. By 6 a.m, we'd raised $4,000 from friends, acquaintances, and complete strangers moved by the story. Tom was overwhelmed, saying he'd never experienced kindness like this and didn't know how to process it. I said he could start by promising to never attempt burglary again, and Tom swore emphatically that this was his first and last crime. The fundraising continued throughout the morning. By noon, we'd hit $8,000, exceeding our goal. Tom was sitting on our couch in a daze, periodically checking the fundraising page on his phone to confirm it was real. He kept saying he'd pay everyone back someday, and we kept telling him that wasn't necessary. This was a gift. Leo suggested we help Tom find employment and housing more systematically. Iris called her cousin, who managed a warehouse on the other side of the city, and explained Tom's situation. The cousin said he was looking for a supervisor and could interview Tom that afternoon if he was available. Tom said he could definitely be available and asked if he could use our shower to clean up first. We gave him fresh clothes, let him shower and shave, and helped him prepare for the interview. At 2 p.m, Iris drove Tom to the warehouse for his interview. He came back 3 hours later with a job offer starting Monday, paying $18 an hour with benefits. Tom cried again, saying he'd gone from burglar to employed in less than 12 hours and couldn't believe this was happening. I said sometimes people just needed a break and some help to get back on their feet. Tom said if he'd actually succeeded in robbing us, he would have traumatized himself with guilt and probably gotten caught eventually anyway. The failed burglary and subsequent trauma we'd put him through had somehow ended up being the best thing that could have happened. Leo found Tom a room in a transitional housing facility that charged $200 a month and helped people get stable. Tom paid his child support debt that afternoon using the fundraising money. His ex-wife called him confused about the payment, and Tom explained he'd gotten a job and wanted to stay current going forward. She sounded skeptical, but agreed to maintain his visitation schedule. Tom was going to see his daughter that weekend for the first time in a month. He showed us pictures of her and talked about how much he'd missed her. She liked dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist. Tom had been terrified he'd lose her forever, and the relief in his voice was overwhelming. We helped Tom move into the transitional housing that evening, with supplies we'd collected, toiletries, some furniture from our storage, and groceries. Tom stood in his small room looking around with something approaching hope on his face. He thanked us repeatedly and said he'd never forget what we'd done for him. I told him he'd better not forget it, because if we ever caught him burglarizing anyone again, we'd make the fake serial killer scenario real. Tom laughed and promised his criminal career was definitively over after one failed attempt. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. 2 days later, Tom called me from the warehouse absolutely panicking. He said his ex-wife's new boyfriend had shown up at his work and confronted him aggressively about the child support payment. The boyfriend, whose name was Derek Paulson, wanted to know where Tom had gotten $3,000 so quickly and was accusing him of dealing drugs or committing crimes. Tom had tried to explain about the fundraiser, but Derek didn't believe him and threatened to report Tom to the police for suspected illegal activity. Tom was terrified because Derek had connections to the local police department through his brother, who was a sergeant. If Derek filed a false report, Tom could lose his new job and his visitation rights even though he'd done nothing wrong. I told Tom to stay calm and that we'd figure something out. I called Leo and Iris and explained the situation. We agreed this Derek guy sounded like a controlling partner who was threatened by Tom's sudden stability. Iris did some research and found Derek's social media profiles. He was exactly what we suspected, a possessive type who'd been trying to push Tom out of his daughter's life completely. Derek had been encouraging Tom's ex-wife to terminate visitation and had apparently been unhappy when Tom paid the child support debt because it meant he couldn't use that against him anymore. Leo suggested we fight fire with fire. If Derek wanted to threaten Tom with false accusations, maybe we should give Derek something real to worry about. I asked what he meant, and Leo said we still had all the props from our fake serial killer scenario. What if we arranged for Derek to see something that made him think Tom had dangerous friends? Iris said that was manipulative and potentially illegal. Leo said so was threatening to file false police reports and trying to separate a father from his daughter. I pointed out that Derek didn't know who we were or that we were involved with Tom at all. If we approached this carefully, we could scare Derek into backing off without directly threatening him. Iris remained skeptical, but admitted she didn't have a better idea. We called Tom and asked for Derek's address and schedule. Tom was uncomfortable giving us that information, but was desperate enough that he provided it. Derek lived in a rental house 20 minutes from our apartment and worked as a shift supervisor at a manufacturing plant. He got home from work around 6 in the evening on weekdays. Leo started planning an operation, while Iris and I tried to inject some sanity into the proceedings. We weren't criminals, and didn't want to become criminals while helping Tom avoid being labeled one. The plan Leo devised was elaborate and borderline insane. We'd follow Derek home from work one evening and stage a scenario that made him think he was being watched by dangerous people connected to Tom. We'd leave evidence that suggested Tom had friends in organized crime who were displeased with Derek's harassment. We wouldn't directly threaten Derek or make contact, just leave psychological breadcrumbs that would make him paranoid enough to leave Tom alone. Iris said this sounded like the plot of a bad thriller movie. Leo said yes, exactly, and those movies worked because people were suggestible when scared. I pointed out that we were accountants, a theater manager, and a graphic designer respectively, not criminal masterminds capable of pulling off psychological operations. Leo said that's what made it perfect, because nobody would suspect us. We argued about this for 2 hours before reluctantly agreeing that we had to do something, and Leo's plan was the only one on the table. Tom called again, sounding more desperate, saying Derek had shown up at his workplace again and been escorted out by security, but not before threatening to hurt Tom if he didn't stay away from his daughter. That made the decision for us. Derek was escalating and needed to be stopped. We followed Derek home from work on a Thursday evening, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice. Derek drove a lifted truck with aggressive bumper stickers and parked it in front of his house. He went inside and we circled the block, observing. His house was a small ranch with no security cameras visible. The neighborhood was quiet and residential. Leo had prepared several props designed to unsettle Derek without being overtly threatening. We waited until midnight when the lights in Derek's house went out. Then Leo, dressed in all black with his face covered, approached Derek's truck and placed a manila envelope under the windshield wiper. Inside, the envelope was a printed note that read, "Leave Tom Carver alone. You're being watched." Attached to the note was a surveillance-style photo of Derek leaving his workplace that we'd taken earlier. Leo returned to our car and we drove away quickly. The next morning, Derek would find the envelope and hopefully be disturbed enough to reconsider his harassment of Tom. Iris said this felt wrong and potentially illegal. Leo said so was Derek's harassment campaign. I said we just have to see if it worked and hope we didn't end up arrested ourselves. Tom called the next afternoon saying Derek had contacted his ex-wife, claiming he was being stalked by some of Tom's associates. Derek was genuinely scared and had demanded Tom make his friends back off. Tom told Derek he had no idea what he was talking about and didn't have any associates. Derek hadn't believed him, but had stopped making threats about filing false police reports. Tom asked if we had anything to do with this, and I said we might have done something small to help him out. Tom said we needed to stop whatever we were doing before someone got hurt or in legal trouble. I agreed, but Leo had different ideas. He said we should escalate slightly to really drive the message home. I asked what he meant, and Leo outlined a plan that would make Derek think he was under surveillance by professional criminals. Iris absolutely refused to participate and said we were going too far. Leo said Derek was a bully who only understood intimidation and needed to be taught a lesson. I was caught between understanding both positions, but leaning toward thinking we should quit while we were ahead. We argued about this throughout the evening without reaching consensus. Tom called again that night begging us to stop because Derek was now talking about getting a gun for protection and the situation was spiraling. That finally convinced Leo to back down. But the story wasn't over. 3 days after we left the envelope on Derek's truck, 2 police officers showed up at our apartment asking to speak with Leo specifically. Derek had apparently reviewed his home security footage from inside his house, which faced the street, and had captured a partial view of someone approaching his truck the night we left the envelope. The footage was grainy and didn't show faces, but showed someone of Leo's general build. Derek had filed a police report for stalking and harassment and named Tom as a suspect, claiming Tom had hired someone to intimidate him. The police had questioned Tom, who naturally denied everything but mentioned he'd recently connected with some people who'd helped him get back on his feet. Derek had demanded the police investigate these people, and somehow they'd tracked us down through the fundraising page which had my name attached. The officers asked Leo if he'd been anywhere near Derek's neighborhood that night. Leo admitted he'd driven through the area but claimed he was just exploring the city. The officers asked if he'd left anything on Derek's truck, and Leo said absolutely not. They asked if we knew Derek or had any reason to harass him. I explained the situation with Tom and how Derek had been threatening him. The officers said that didn't give us the right to stalk or intimidate anyone. They asked for Leo's phone to check his location data from that night. Leo had been smart enough to turn off location services before our operation, but the officers said that itself was suspicious. They informed us they'd be investigating further, and that if evidence connected us to the envelope or any harassment of Derek, we'd face criminal charges. After they left, we had an emergency meeting. Leo was facing potential stalking charges. Tom was being investigated. Derek was claiming victimhood despite being the original aggressor. Everything had gone sideways. Iris said she'd warned us this would happen. Leo admitted he'd screwed up and should have listened. I was worried about all of us facing legal consequences for trying to help someone. Tom called crying, saying he felt terrible that we were in trouble because of him. He offered to confess to everything and take full responsibility. I told him absolutely not. He'd finally gotten his life together and wasn't throwing that away. We needed to be smart about this. I called a lawyer friend who specialized in criminal defense and explained the situation hypothetically. She said if the police couldn't prove we'd actually done anything beyond driving in a public neighborhood, the case would likely be dropped. The envelope had no fingerprints because Leo had been wearing gloves. The surveillance photo of Derek was taken from a public street, which was legal. The note itself wasn't overtly threatening, just vague. The worst charge we might face was harassment, which was a misdemeanor. She advised complete cooperation with the investigation and absolute denial of any wrongdoing. The investigation dragged on for 3 weeks. Police interviewed all of us multiple times. They searched Leo's car and found nothing incriminating. They analyzed the envelope and note but couldn't connect them to us. Derek kept insisting we'd stalked and threatened him but couldn't provide concrete evidence. Tom maintained he knew nothing about any harassment campaign. The police eventually concluded there wasn't enough evidence to file charges against anyone. Derek was furious, but legally there was nothing more he could do. The detective who handled the case told us privately that he suspected we'd been involved but couldn't prove it, and advised us to never do anything like that again regardless of the provocation. We agreed enthusiastically. Derek filed a restraining order against Tom, which Tom's lawyer fought successfully by proving Derek had been the original aggressor. The judge denied the restraining order and warned Derek about making false accusations. Tom's ex-wife, who'd been watching all of this unfold, finally stood up to Derek and told him to stop interfering with Tom's visitation. She admitted Derek had been pressuring her to cut Tom out completely, and she'd been wrong to go along with it. Derek and Tom's ex broke up shortly after, and Tom's relationship with his daughter slowly began to improve. 6 months later, Tom came to our apartment for dinner, bringing his daughter Lily with him. She was a bright 8-year-old who immediately started telling us about her dinosaur collection and her science fair project on fossils. Tom had been working steadily at the warehouse and had saved enough for his own apartment. He'd been current on child support and had regular visitation with Lily every weekend. He'd also started volunteering at a homeless shelter to help others in the situation he'd escaped. Tom said his failed burglary attempt had changed his entire life trajectory, and he was grateful every day for how things had turned out, even the scary parts. Lily asked what scary parts, and Tom said just some grown-up problems that had worked out fine. Iris had brought props from her theater collection and did a puppet show for Lily, who was absolutely delighted. Leo taught her some magic tricks. I showed her my collection of accounting spreadsheets, which she found incomprehensibly boring, but was too polite to say. Tom watched all of this with tears in his eyes again, saying he'd almost lost all of this because of one desperate night. I reminded him he'd also gained it back because people had chosen to help instead of just punish. Tom said he'd spent months trying to figure out how to thank us properly and had concluded there wasn't an adequate way, so he'd settled for living the best life he could and helping others when possible. Derek had moved to a different city after the breakup and restraining order situation. His brother, the police sergeant, had been quietly reprimanded for trying to use his position to help Derek harass Tom. Tom's ex-wife, Rebecca, had apologized to Tom for allowing Derek to manipulate her, and they'd worked out a better co-parenting arrangement. Rebecca admitted she'd been struggling financially too, and Derek had seemed like stability, but his controlling behavior had gotten worse over time. She said Tom's sudden turnaround had shocked her and made her realize she'd been wrong to try to cut him out of Lily's life. Tom said they'd never get back together, but were becoming better friends than they'd been as spouses. Lily was happier now that her parents weren't fighting, and she got to spend time with both of them. Tom showed us his bank account, which had grown to nearly $4,000 in savings. He'd paid back his portion of the fundraising money to several people who'd insisted they wanted it back, though most donors had refused repayment. The fundraising page had eventually raised almost $12,000, and Tom had used the excess to help 3 other families at his transitional housing avoid eviction. He'd become a volunteer coordinator there and was helping others navigate the social services system he'd struggled with. His warehouse supervisor had promoted him to trainer, which came with a pay increase. The best part was that Tom's story had inspired Leo, Iris, and me to start a legitimate nonprofit helping people in crisis situations. We called it Second Chance Interventions and focused on providing emergency financial assistance and job placement help to people facing homelessness or family separation. Tom became our first success story and our most dedicated volunteer. We partnered with local shelters and social workers who referred clients to us. In our first year, we helped 18 families avoid eviction, placed 12 people in jobs, and prevented 4 cases of child custody loss due to poverty. We fundraised through events and online campaigns. Leo handled outreach and social media. Iris managed the volunteer program and intake process. I dealt with finances and administration. We operated on a shoestring budget, but made every dollar count. Tom spoke at several of our fundraising events, telling his story of attempted burglary turned redemption. Audiences were moved by his honesty about hitting rock bottom and grateful for the community that had lifted him up instead of just punishing him. Several donors said they'd initially thought our approach was too soft on crime until they heard Tom's perspective and realized that desperation drove most property crimes, and addressing root causes was more effective than just incarceration. We never told anyone publicly about the part where we'd staged a fake serial killer scenario or left threatening notes on Derek's truck. Those details stayed between us and Tom. Iris still felt guilty about traumatizing Tom, even though he insisted it had been necessary and effective. Leo had learned his lesson about escalating situations and now channeled his creative energy into legitimate advocacy work. I'd learned that sometimes helping people required bending normal social rules, but there was a line that shouldn't be crossed. We'd come close to crossing that line with Derek and had been lucky to avoid serious legal consequences. The detective who'd investigated us actually called months later and admitted he'd figured out we'd been involved with the envelope but respected what we'd been trying to do, even if our methods were questionable. He said Derek had a history of domestic violence calls at his previous address, and the department had been concerned about his relationship with Rebecca but couldn't intervene without her cooperation. Our interference, while legally gray, had potentially prevented a worse situation. He advised us to keep doing our nonprofit work, but stay away from vigilante tactics, no matter how justified they seemed. We promised we would. Tom eventually wrote a book about his experience called Stuck, From Burglar to Volunteer. He detailed his downward spiral into desperation, the failed burglary attempt, and the unexpected kindness that had saved him. He included the fake serial killer scenario with our permission, changing our names and some identifying details. The book sold modestly, but got attention from criminal justice reform advocates who used it as an example of alternative approaches to property crime. Tom was invited to speak at several universities and policy forums about his perspective on poverty-driven crime. He argued passionately that most property criminals were desperate rather than malicious, and that addressing root causes through rapid intervention was more effective and humane than traditional prosecution. His testimony influenced several local policymakers to increase funding for emergency financial assistance programs. Tom's ex-cellmate from the night he spent in police custody during the initial arrest had reached out after reading the book, and Tom had helped him find housing and employment too. That man had connected Tom with 3 other recently released offenders who needed help. Tom's network of people helping people kept growing. Our nonprofit formalized this into a peer mentorship program where people who'd been helped became mentors for new clients. Tom trained all the mentors himself, teaching them about trauma-informed assistance and the importance of dignity in crisis intervention. On the 1-year anniversary of Tom's failed burglary, we threw a celebration at our apartment. Tom brought Lily, Rebecca came too, several people Tom had helped attended, our nonprofit volunteers showed up, and even the detective who'd investigated us stopped by to congratulate us on avoiding trouble for 12 consecutive months. Tom gave a speech thanking us for saving his life, and then presented us with a plaque that read, "To the people who traumatized me so badly, I became a better person." Everyone laughed, and Tom explained the context to confused attendees. Lily was horrified to learn her father had tried to burglarize someone, but also proud that he'd turned his life around so completely. She'd drawn him a picture of a dinosaur with a cape labeled Super Daddy, and Tom cried when she gave it to him, saying that was worth more than anything he'd almost stolen that night. Leo showed everyone the original photos of Tom stuck in my window, and Tom allowed it because enough time had passed that he could laugh about it. Iris performed a dramatic reenactment of the fake serial killer scenario with props and sound effects. I presented statistics on our nonprofit's first-year impact. The detective gave an unofficial endorsement of our work and advised any potential criminals in attendance to choose better life paths. Rebecca thanked us for helping Tom become a present father and admitted she'd been wrong to listen to Derek's manipulation. The party went until midnight and felt like a proper celebration of second chances and community support. 2 years after the burglar incident, Tom got promoted to warehouse operations manager, doubling his salary. He moved into a real apartment with 2 bedrooms, so Lily could have her own room during visitation weekends. Rebecca had started dating someone new who treated her well and respected Tom's role as Lily's father. Lily had maintained straight A's in school and was still obsessed with dinosaurs. She'd decided she wanted to be a paleontologist who also helped homeless people in her spare time, combining her scientific interests with her father's advocacy work. Tom's book had been optioned for a television adaptation, which wouldn't make him rich, but would spread the message about alternative approaches to crime. Our nonprofit had grown to serve 5 neighboring counties and had helped over 60 families in crisis. We'd hired 2 full-time staff members and had 30 active volunteers. Tom remained our volunteer coordinator and most passionate advocate. We'd partnered with police departments to pilot a diversion program where officers could refer people arrested for first-time minor offenses to our program instead of prosecution. The program showed promising results with only a 12% recidivism rate compared to 40% for traditional prosecution. Several cities were considering implementing similar programs based on our model. The strangest part was that we occasionally encountered other attempted burglars through our work. One man Tom helped had tried to break into a pharmacy for medication. Another had attempted shoplifting food. Several had stolen to support addictions. Each one had a desperation story behind their criminal act. We approached each case with the same philosophy we'd used with Tom, addressing root causes while holding people accountable through community service and restitution rather than just punishment. Not everyone succeeded. Some people weren't ready for help or returned to crime despite assistance. But enough succeeded that we knew the model worked when people were genuinely committed to changing. Tom had become an expert at spotting which clients were truly desperate versus which were running scams. He caught two people lying about their circumstances and confronted them with compassion but firmness, offering help if they'd be honest, but refusing to enable manipulation. Both eventually admitted their lies and accepted genuine help for their actual problems, which were different from what they'd claimed. Tom's ability to connect with people in crisis while maintaining healthy boundaries made him exceptional at this work. We'd encouraged him to get formal training, and he'd enrolled in a social work certificate program at the community college. Lily attended the graduation ceremony when Tom completed the program and was more proud than when he'd gotten promoted at the warehouse. The viral attention our nonprofit received led to unexpected opportunities. A national foundation focused on criminal justice reform gave us a grant to expand our services. We were invited to present at conferences about innovative approaches to property crime. Graduate students wrote thesis papers analyzing our model. Tom did interviews with podcasts and news outlets about his transformation from burglar to advocate. Every interview started with him describing getting stuck in my window and ended with him discussing policy implications. The contrast between the absurd beginning and serious conclusions resonated with audiences who appreciated both the humor and the deeper message. Tom never shied away from the embarrassing details because he said humanizing offenders was important for building empathy. He wanted people to see criminals as fellow humans who made bad choices under pressure rather than as monsters beyond redemption. His vulnerability in sharing his lowest moment made his redemption arc more powerful. People connected with his story because it showed how quickly someone could fall into desperation and how transformative genuine help could be. Tom said if he'd been arrested that night instead of helped, he'd probably be in prison now. Lily would have grown up without a father, and he'd likely have returned to crime after release because he'd have no other options. Instead, he had a career, a relationship with his daughter, a purpose helping others, and a future full of possibilities. We never did figure out whether traumatizing Tom with the fake serial killer scenario was ethically justified or just a weird thing we did that happened to work out. Iris maintained it was wrong, regardless of outcome. Leo argued the ends justified the means in this case. I fell somewhere in between, thinking we'd been lucky that our risky gamble had paid off, but wouldn't recommend it as a general strategy. Tom said it had been absolutely necessary because he'd needed something shocking enough to jolt him out of his downward spiral and make him realize he'd hit bottom. The embarrassment and fear had motivated him to accept help rather than retreat into defensive denial. If we'd just been kind without the trauma, he might have taken advantage of the kindness without changing his behavior. The trauma had made him vulnerable enough to accept genuine help. Whether that was true or just Tom rationalizing what happened to him, we'd never know for certain. What we knew for certain was that the current outcome was good, and we'd all grown from the experience in unexpected ways. Tom had found purpose. We'd started a nonprofit that helped dozens of people. Lily had a present father. The community had one less desperate person committing crimes. Sometimes trauma and comedy and kindness combined in strange ways that changed lives. 3 years after the incident, we got a call from someone who'd read Tom's book and wanted to confess. He'd been planning to burglarize our apartment the same night Tom had broken in, but had seen Tom get stuck in the window and decided to abort his own attempt. He'd watched from the bushes as we pulled Tom through the window and then heard us talking through the open windows about our plan to traumatize him. He'd been so terrified by what he'd heard that he'd gone home, never committed any crimes, and eventually got help for his own financial crisis through legitimate means. He said our unintentional performance had saved him from making the same mistake Tom made. He wanted to thank us and offer to volunteer with our nonprofit. We were stunned that our fake serial killer scenario had deterred an actual second burglar we'd never known about. Tom was delighted by the irony. Leo felt vindicated about his theatrical approach. Iris admitted this changed her perspective slightly on the ethics of what we'd done. The second almost burglar, whose name was Marcus Lee, became one of our best volunteers and eventually shared his own story publicly about how witnessing someone else's failed crime and redemption had inspired him to seek help before hitting his own bottom. His story added another layer to our nonprofit's narrative about creative intervention and community support. We titled our next fundraising campaign, Traumatized Burglars into Better Life Choices, which was tongue-in-cheek, but got attention and donations. Tom thought it was hilarious. Iris thought it was in poor taste, but effective. Leo wanted to make t-shirts, but we vetoed that. 5 years after Tom got stuck in my window, our nonprofit had grown into a regional organization with satellite offices in 4 cities. We'd helped over 200 families avoid crisis and had a documented success rate of 83%, meaning 83% of our clients hadn't reoffended or returned to crisis situations within 2 years of receiving help. Tom had become our executive director, a role he'd earned through his dedication and effectiveness. Lily was 13 and volunteering with our youth mentorship program, helping kids whose parents were in crisis situations similar to what she'd experienced. She'd maintained her straight A's and her dinosaur obsession, though she'd expanded her interests to include social justice activism. She'd organized a fundraiser at her middle school that raised $4,000 for our nonprofit. Tom cried again when she presented the check, saying his daughter had become the person he'd been trying to be. Rebecca had married the new boyfriend, and they had a baby, giving Lily a half-sister she adored. Tom was cordial with Rebecca's husband, and they'd found a functional co-parenting rhythm. Tom had started dating someone he'd met through the nonprofit, another volunteer who appreciated his dedication to helping others. Leo had left his accounting job to work full-time with the nonprofit as operations director. Iris had done the same, becoming program director. I remained in accounting but volunteered 20 hours weekly managing our finances. We'd become a tightly bonded team united by the strange incident that had started everything. The detective who'd investigated us had retired and written his own book about innovative policing approaches, dedicating a chapter to our model and calling us accidental genius for stumbling into an effective intervention strategy through well-meaning chaos. He'd become an advocate for diversion programs and testified before legislative committees about alternatives to incarceration. Derek had apparently found religion and written Tom an apology letter for his behavior years earlier. Tom had accepted the apology and sent a kind response, but maintained healthy boundaries. Rebecca said Derek had moved several states away and was in therapy dealing with his control issues. Tom's original lawyer friend, who'd advised us during the investigation, had joined our nonprofit's board of directors and provided pro bono legal services. The fundraising page we'd created for Tom had been turned into a permanent donation portal that had raised over $100,000 for our organization over the years. Several of the original donors had become monthly contributors and active volunteers. The story of Tom's transformation had inspired a ripple effect of generosity and community engagement that continued spreading. People who'd been helped went on to help others, who then helped more people, creating an expanding network of support and second chances. Tom stood at our 5-year anniversary celebration, giving a keynote speech about how getting stuck in a window had been the best thing that ever happened to him. He joked that he'd initially intended to steal maybe $300 worth of electronics, but had accidentally stumbled into stealing all our hearts instead. The audience of 200 people, including clients, volunteers, donors, and community partners, laughed and applauded. He talked about the fake serial killer scenario and how terrifying it had been, but also how necessary that jolt had been to break through his denial and desperation. He described the moment we'd started helping him, instead of just punishing him, and how incomprehensible that kindness had been. He said he'd spent 5 years trying to pay forward what we'd done for him, and would spend the rest of his life continuing that mission. He introduced Lily, who spoke about growing up watching her father transform from someone who'd made terrible choices to someone who dedicated his life to helping others avoid making those same choices. She said she was proud of her dad and proud of the community that had given him a second chance. She challenged everyone in the room to look for opportunities to help people in crisis rather than just judging them. Her speech received a standing ovation, and Tom was crying again because of course he was. We presented Tom with another plaque, this one reading, "5 years of not being a burglar. We're so proud." Tom laughed and displayed it prominently in his office next to the original traumatization plaque. We'd built something meaningful from chaos and comedy and compassion, proving that sometimes the strangest interventions created the best outcomes. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So, subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.